Hello and welcome this evening to another fine presentation offered to you via Webex from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I'm Dave, you're the audience, and I appreciate you joining in either here on Webex this evening or if you're listening to the recording on YouTube as well. You're here for this program from the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy. Sarah Walsh is the director of the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy, which conducts conservation work in Albany, Schenectady, and Montgomery counties. MHLC has been conserving and stewarding the lands and waters of the Mohawk and Hudson River valleys for the benefit of the people and of the environment since 1992. This presentation will provide a brief overview of what the organization is and also introduce their latest partnership with the Nature Conservancy to address wildlife crossings in the region. So please welcome Sarah Walsh.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks to Schoharie Crossing for hosting this evening. Just want to see if everybody can hear me okay. A thumbs up maybe from the host. Perfect. Great. So I'm going to start off this evening's presentation with just a quick overview of Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy, who we are and what we do. So Dave mentioned in his introduction that we have been around since 1992, preserving and stewarding the lands of the Mohawk and the Hudson River valleys. We've conserved over 12,500 acres in the 3 counties of Albany, Schenectady, and Montgomery counties. And I'm Webexing from Albany County tonight. And the 3 counties that we serve are located in the traditional lands of the Mohawk and the Mohican peoples. So I would be remiss if I didn't let you know about the different ways that you can engage with us. We have 21 actually now preserves where you can get outside. We just opened our first trail at the Bender Mellon Farm Preserve in Voorheesville back in October. But we offer 21 beautiful preserves in Albany, Schenectady, Montgomery County where you can get outside. This is free and open to the public. All of our preserves offer kiosks and parking areas like you can see in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. And we offer trail apps, so it's almost impossible to get lost on our trail system. And we just try to make nature accessible for everyone in the outdoors. I'm here today to talk to you about our Mohawk Watershed program, a pathway from the Catskills to the Adirondacks. We have been working in the Capital Region. Next year it'll be 30 years, and our goal is to refine the work that we do towards a larger goal, and that is to actually connect the Catskills to the Adirondacks. Our 3 county area sits very nicely between these 2 areas, and through this partnership with the Nature Conservancy, we're working to refine this. And I'm going to walk you through the conservation science and the project that we're working on right now that's addressing wildlife connectivity in this region and in your backyard. So the 4 pillars essentially for this project are to bring together partners, which include parks and Schoharie Crossing, the audience that's here today, also municipal partners and other conservation partners to talk about this project. We're doing some field work that's already been completed, and I'm going to share some exclusive photos from the ground with you on that. From that field work, we're going to analyze our findings, and then we're going to create a vision. And all of this is going towards this larger idea of a connectivity plan. So what is Catskill to Adirondack? One of the things that's happened with conservation science in the last few years is scientists have started thinking less about what's happening in just the small jurisdiction of your backyard, but thinking about conservation areas in a larger context. So when we think about conservation, we're thinking about how does the Capital Region fit in New York State, in New England, and in the Northeast. And so that's what we call landscape scale conservation. And Catskill to Adirondack is actually a larger linkage. And I'm going to break this down a little bit for you too to help you understand the conservation science, which is very interesting. But these concepts are really important because it's thinking more in terms of how wildlife think about the landscape and less about how humans think about the landscape. So back in 2020, we worked with the Staying Connected initiative. This is an initiative that covers from New Jersey to Maine, the entire New England, northeastern coast, and then also the provinces of southern Canada, including Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, um, to Nova Scotia, I should say. And so this Staying Connected initiative actually acknowledged the Catskill to Adirondack linkage in 2020 as a reasonable linkage for connectivity. And the image here on the left is the conservation science. So this is the Nature Conservancy's um, resilient and connected landscapes mapping that is showing you the Adirondack Park here and the edge of the Catskills and how there are these resilient bands in this Y shape that actually connect from the Catskills to the Adirondacks through the capital region. So after SCI, or the Staying Connected Initiative, recognize the official Mohawk linkage or Catskill Adirondack linkage, this set the stage for us to be able to do some more work to learn more about the area, to make some conservation priorities, and to address some issues for wildlife. I wanted to take a zoom out again because we're talking about landscape scale conservation to look at New York State and provide some other examples of linkages that the Staying Connected Initiative and the Nature Conservancy are working on. You may have heard of some of these. Adirondacks to Algonquin, or Algonquin to Adirondack, A to A, has been around for many, many years. This is the Algonquin Park connecting to the Adirondacks via a granitic shield through the Thousand Islands. The A to A has been a collaborative partnership that's been working both in the United States and in Canada for many, many years. There's also the Adirondacks to Greens, and so ensuring this connectivity between these two conservation areas. Also the Tug Hill Plateau to Adirondack. You can see our Mohawk linkage here that we'll talk a little bit more about. This is the Kittatinny Range in southern New York, and then the Berkshires to Hudson Highlands. That includes pieces of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont. When we're talking about these linkages, we're talking about wildlife connectivity and the importance of connecting these areas together for the sake of wildlife, for gene flow, but also climate change. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. This is the map courtesy of the Nature Conservancy. This shows their connected and resilient land mapping. So the green areas include those connected networks all across the northeastern seaboard here. The red star represents where we are. And so this is actually the central Appalachian Mountains through here. This is the northern Appalachians, or the northern Apps. And so our linkage, the Catskills to the Adirondacks, is the Catskills, and these are the Adirondacks, and we're that red star in the middle. We are that connector between the central Apps and the northern Apps, and that's why our backyards are actually much more important than we may have thought. So I want to zoom in on this a little bit to give you a flavor for what we're looking at. The blue line and the lighter blue line in the south here, this is the Catskill boundary for the Catskill Park, and the darker blue in the north is the boundary to the Adirondack Park. And all I did in this slide was basically throw this resilient and connected lands data from the Nature Conservancy on top of here to give you an idea of what the scientists are looking at when they determine what a good linkage is. And so you can see that the green areas are vulnerable, those vulnerable areas, this dark green tends to be where there is a lot of development. So you can see around the city of Albany, Schenectady, Saratoga Springs, Pittsfield. Those are all areas that are tend to have lots of development. Climate corridors tend to be areas where there's a lot of connected lands that are also high up, because the more topography you have, the more resiliency you have, or the ability to bounce back from change, including climate change. Resiliency areas, again, have resiliency to bounce back from climate change. This is also related to topography. And then there's resilient areas with confirmed diversity. And if you go back to your general biology, you'll remember that the more organisms or animals that exist in an area, in different kinds of species, the more likely you are to be able to bounce back from things like pathogens, pandemics, and changes in the habitat. And so resilient areas with confirmed diversity and climate flow zones with confirmed diversity are some of the best areas to prioritize for conservation, to ensure that as the climate changes, wildlife still has a place to be. And so you can see in this um, landscape here, in this linkage, that there is a lot going on, and that there are lots of vulnerable areas, there's development that's existing, but there's also these nice climate flow zones with confirmed diversity. There's some resilient areas that exist. And so when scientists look at a map like this, they start by drawing sort of a basic shape. You know, if we were to connect these areas and think like an animal, and provide the safest pathway with the least resistance and the most resiliency to change, which way might they go? And so this was me putting on my wildlife scientist hat, which I do have a degree in that, but it's been a while since I've done the hardcore mapping. But essentially, I took the marker and drew this orange shape that you can see, outlined some of these purple areas, climate flow zones, some of the resilient areas, and sort of helped focus where animals could cross, and what areas might be high priorities for conservation in this linkage. This is zooming in a little bit closer, so you can see this is the orange that I had drawn. All I did was zoom in a little bit to be able to show you a little bit more of what's on the ground and what could be near your backyard. And when the scientists at the Nature Conservancy, the analysts took a look at this, they identified two specific areas that were considered pinch points. And these are those areas where, if you remember from the Mohawk linkage image I showed you earlier, where it Y's, it creates like 2 points um, off to the northeast and to the northwest. And this is the Glenville Hill area, and then this is the noses, Big Nose and Little Nose, over near Sprakers. And so these are areas where you can see that purple, that climate flow with confirmed diversity is happening, and the resilient areas are happening on both sides of the rivers, which is the Mohawk in this case. And so these are focal points for conservation because of that. So if we're taking a look at this landscape scale connection, which is quite a lot of acreage, it's very far away from each other. You know, what are some of the challenges in connecting this large landscape together when you're doing the work like we are through land conservation, and thinking about those wildlife moving through the landscape? So this is an image of the noses. This is Little Nose. This is Big Nose. Anyone who's driven, you know, out of the capital region on Interstate 90 and is coming back towards Albany, you know, probably recognizes these two promontories along the thruway. Imagine yourself a black bear or some other animal that's trying to get from this side of the road across 6 lanes of traffic, swimming across the Mohawk, avoiding the train traffic, Route 5, and then trying to get either with your cubs in tow or trying to find a mate that you're not related to, and being faced with this landscape. This is definitely a challenge. I always say when I look at this image that I think that the swim across the Mohawk is the easiest part if I were a black bear. Everything else would be incredibly difficult. But there are ways that we can help wildlife tackle these tough crossings. And one of the ways is by looking at culverts and bridges and passages under the road. These are some examples of culverts and bridges that you could come across as examples of ways that wildlife can avoid being on the roads, but actually crossing underneath. And you can see how some of these, like the one in the top left and the bottom left, are much more conducive for wildlife movement, while the ones on the right-hand side are much less. So we're taking a look at these culverts in those two pinch points with the Nature Conservancy, and these are some of the species that we're looking at targeting. There are two of these photos are local, so these bobcats actually were in the one of the Albany County newspapers. I think in the last 2 years, this fisher was actually taken in Albany County, just up the road from where I am in Altamont. But we're also looking at other megafauna or big mammals like black bear and white-tailed deer, not only for the sake of animals being able to cross safely to find mates, but also to reduce vehicle collisions as well. So how do we address these challenges for wildlife crossing in these, highly man-made um, impediments to their normal crossing areas? Well, the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative came up with a way to address this movement through culverts for aquatic life. So this is stuff that swims, like this beautiful trout that's here. And so for years, scientists have been working on studying anadromous and catadromous fish. These are fishes that travel either from freshwater to saltwater or saltwater to freshwater to go back to their native spawning grounds, and ensuring that these culverts can allow for that safe passage. So there's a protocol that they actually do, and you can see two folks here that are taking a look to assess this culvert for aquatic connectivity, um, to be able to determine, if this is adequate for that kind of passage or not, and if it isn't, how can they fix it to make it better? And so this collaborative has actually been working really hard to actually create not only a protocol for the aquatic, but now they've added terrestrial mammals or animals that walk on dry land to that protocol, so that now when you look at a culvert, you can assess it both for aquatic movement and for terrestrial movement. So the Nature Conservancy had hired technicians this year. They just wrapped up in late September. These are actually real folks on the ground in Montgomery County, walking to one of the crossings for the bike path, and actually might be Schenectady County, and assessing this bridge and seeing what could be done for aquatic movement. You can see aquatic movement's doing pretty okay here right now. The water was very high when we took a walk through here. But if you are an animal that doesn't prefer to get your feet wet, you might want to go over the road instead. And so providing some kind of dry passage here is what you would do, providing options for both aquatic and for those animals that need dry passage all in the same area, to encourage them to cross under instead of over. This is Brian, this is Emma, and this is Alyssa. These are the two technicians from the Nature Conservancy, and Alyssa is the wildlife connectivity specialist that I'm working with out of the Adirondack office. And you can see here they're assessing this bridge. This actually has great aquatic connectivity. You can see on the right and on the left, there's actually some strong riprap or big boulders that are stacked up along here. And the idea was that this would stabilize the sides of this structure, but also it would provide for passage for animals underneath as well. And scientists have been studying different species and how they react to these opportunities to cross, because they want to encourage them to head there. So they've actually found that white-tailed deer, for example, don't necessarily like to walk on riprap because of the holes that can happen for their little hooves to get stuck in. They actually prefer to have a dirt path on top of riprap that's nice and flat. And so that would be one of the culvert or the under bridge upgrades that would be recommended for this site. So these two technicians traveled up and down routes 88, Route 90, 5 and 5S and took a look at every single crossing within those 2 pinch points that I mentioned, Glenville Hill and the Sprakers pinch point in Montgomery County, and points in between. They mapped them all. They did those aquatic connectivity assessments. Um, and here are some examples of ways that those crossings could be improved. Up on the left-hand side, we see a critter shelf. This is just corrugated steel, and this is just put on an existing culvert that you can see here. And I'll show you what that looks like when it's in use in a minute here. But this is a way you can retrofit an existing area or an existing culvert to make it more conducive for wildlife crossings. You can see here that there's actually some nice stone, so there's a dry passage option here. And again, you might want to put in just a little bit wider with some dirt for those white-tailed deer and to cross. In this instance, you can see this really nice buck is crossing underneath a bridge here. Another option is to be able to dig this out a little bit to create more of a flat passage and encourage those animals to head that direction. And of course, this is the dream scenario in the bottom right, which is an overpass. You see a lot of these out west where you have more large migratory groups of animals like elk, mule deer, pronghorn. They've also in the West done some really hardcore studies on grizzly bears because the populations are dwindling. But female grizzly bears actually will not go underneath the road with their cubs, female grizzly bears. They prefer an overpass, which makes perfect sense. You know, if you had your kids and you were going to walk down, would you walk down the dark alley or would you walk up high in a well-lit overpass? And so, you know, we're learning so much from all the conservation science work that's happening out there to be able to make these crossings better for wildlife, to really make a balance between the built environment that humans need to travel and wildlife's environment that they need to find mates, but also shift as the climate shifts, which is why, you know, we may see passes in the north sometime soon. And I will also note that the recent infrastructure bill, I think there's $350 million allocated towards wildlife crossings solely within that infrastructure bill. And I know like Wildlands Network is really hopeful that that money will end up in seeing more overpasses and infrastructure improvements like this for wildlife. So there's more harmony there. These are some images from the actual game cameras that we placed at each of the locations. So we picked some of the different culverts and bridge crossings, and I just wanted to share some of these. They're really fun to see who's using the existing, you know, passageways. This was really interesting. You can see the spots still on this fawn, and this was taken August 1st of this year. So this is, you know, one of this year's young that's actually running through here, not being on the road, getting their feet wet instead. I also liked this one. This is a great blue heron, which is, you can see these are its wings, and this is its head. It's actually flying under the bridge and headed out. There's another image of this where the bird is standing on this edge and fishing off of it, which is really interesting. How they are actually using, you know, some of these platforms to fish and to feed from. The next two images are some of my, well, they're all my favorite, but this is one of my favorites. This is actually a fisher, and you can see this is the back of the fisher's head with an ear here and an ear here. And you can see that long, they're in the weasel family. They have this nice long neck, long body, long tail. Fish are really important because they are one of those species that requires a large home range, and they also, you know, are dwindling because of human encroachment into their habitats. It's great to see that one is out and about in the region and happy and healthy. This is actually a fisher walking away from us, and this is the head of the skunk, and then this is the body of the skunk. So it is actually carrying home a very stinky dinner which I thought was very interesting. Fisher are usually known for killing porcupines because they can actually flip them off the tree without getting their spines. But the skunk was one that really, you're pretty brave to be eating that for dinner. So this one I call my first day of school photo. You know, the kids are always proud with their backpacks. This is two little eyes here of an otter that got captured on camera that's moving through the water. Really lovely to see otter, another, you know, species that is often unseen. They don't like to be interacting with humans too often, and so knowing that they're out and about and using these crossings is really lovely. And we hope to improve those areas so that this continues to happen. This was taken August 10th. So this is a young raccoon family. These are babies from this year. You can see these are the two little ones. And this is the parent teaching them how to fish. Again, they're using, this is, it might be the same site that the great blue heron was at. But you can see they're using the riprap as a way to stand on the edge and put their little paws in the water and hunt for crayfish and things. This is not from our game cameras, but this is, you know, another bandit family, and this is actually what a critter shelf looks like in use. Um, and I've seen images from other projects, the Tug Hill Plateau to Adirondack, where groundhogs and other, you know, small mammals like these guys really appreciate a critter shelf because sometimes the water's so deep and moving so quickly they can't swim without endangering their lives. And so the critter shelf is really a great way to upgrade a culvert quickly to allow passage safely for these critters, get them off the road, and still existing on the landscape. So the images that you just saw happened from this summer. So that's brand new information that we're sharing with the public. And again, we are working to bring together partners. We're completing that field work. We're analyzing our findings from that field work. And then we're creating a vision for connectivity between the Catskills and the Adirondacks for wildlife, um, which is very exciting. So I wanted to talk really quickly about why is this so important? Um, I think you can tell that for me, I'm very excited about wildlife. I love them very much and like to see them on the landscape in the future. Um, but I think that the concept of Catskill to Adirondack is really important. And here's why. When you see this sign when you're driving north or northeast in the case of you know, Schoharie Crossing, um, you know, you have a general idea of what to expect as a New Yorker when you're headed into the Adirondack Park. And so this is the definition of um, a conserved area by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And a protected area is clearly defined geographic space. It's recognized, dedicated, and managed. There's legal or other effective means to protect this long-term um, place that has great ecosystem services and cultural values. And so when we see that sign, that's really what we're talking about. The Adirondack Park is a special place because of the natural um, resources that are there, the ecosystem services it provides. And so by creating the park and the shape of the park and talking about it in these ways, we have a really good idea of what to expect when we go there. Very similar like when you go to a New York State park, you know, or a historical site. You know what you're looking for. This is another example of a conservation area. This is Yellowstone to Yukon. So just to give you an orientation, this is the northwest of the United States. And then this is the mapped area of Yellowstone Park down here, all the way up into the Yukon Territory. They use a grizzly bear as their mascot because that was one of the main reasons that Y2Y was created. The geographic connections for grizzly bears have been lost, and so is the genetic diversity. And so over the last 20 years, they've been working with multiple partners across multiple jurisdictions, states, provinces, countries, to be able to reconnect grizzly bears to ensure that they have enough genetic diversity to last long term on the landscape. This year in Washington State was the first time they had a radio-collared sow or a female grizzly bear with her cubs um, actually show up in Washington State, first documented in nearly a decade. And so after 20 years of working really, really hard and having a name, Yellowstone to Yukon, that people can recognize and stand behind and support, they've been able to do great work for conservation for wildlife, not just for grizzly bears, but for all the other animals that exist in this large corridor. We had mentioned 8A earlier, Algonquin to Adirondack. This is a little bit of a zoom in. So this is Algonquin Park in Ontario. This is at the Adirondack Park, which we know well. You can see there's a little shadow of a moose here and here. Um, this organization uses Alice the moose as an example. She was radio collared and captured in Newcomb, New York. The little black dotted trail shows Alice's path as she moves across and through the Thousand Islands region and up into Algonquin Park. The geology is the same, and so are the plants and animals that exist between these two conservation areas. And so movement of animals between these two areas is incredibly important to ensure that they can breed with animals that they're not related to increase their genetic pool, to ensure their longevity on the landscape. 8A has since created their own 8A trail, which is the red trail. And they've done their best to emulate Alice's journey to raise awareness for this corridor, its importance, and why conservation within it is so important. This is an example I saw of a large landscape presentation, and I just loved the concept for, the next 120 kilometers, which is really far, ensuring drivers take care because there's wildlife crossing the roads. And wouldn't it be fun to have entering Catskill to Adirondack corridor, please, drive safely. And so the idea of creating this Catskill to Adirondack corridor is to, be able to bring together partners so that we can all do more work towards conserving lands um, for the betterment of wildlife. Our first step is, bringing together partners, completing some field work, analyzing our findings, creating the vision for that connectivity plan. And the idea is that we will be able to address wildlife crossings in these pinch points, but we will also be doing some refined mapping where we will come in later on in this project is to do some land conservation on either side of these pinch points so that the wildlife have room to be able to find safe crossings, to stay off the roads um, and still find their magical mates on the other side. So that is the end of my presentation. I am the conservation director for Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy, and I've been there for about 5 years. Um, and my job is to work on projects like this, which I'm very lucky, and work with wonderful landowners on conservation easements and donations of properties to create preserves. Um, and I was so glad to be able to be invited and share this with you this evening, and I'm looking forward to answering some questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was really great. Um, for those of you that have joined in, if you have some questions, make sure you drop them in the chat. I was uh, making sure that there's also the link that's provided in there to the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy's website. I just put in the YouTube link that has been provided on this screen and some more contact information. So feel free to check that out. So I was going to make a couple of points as some questions come in, such as how much I really do appreciate and enjoy that approach in viewing the landscape of how wildlife would view the landscape, not as humans. Um, I think that's vitally important. You don't have to convince me of that. I've already bought into that idea. I like it. Um, and so some other wonderful points that maybe I would make a point in saying myself. It's that matter of I'm thinking about the wildlife and their functionality with the environment. and survival. Um, but you talking about the diversity in the gene pool uh, is is more of maybe like a light bulb moment for me, and not really thinking entirety in the complexity of that gene pool, needing the diversity for the resilience. So I'm glad that you uh, kind of flipped the switch in my brain on that one. Um, but at the same point, I would say like, and maybe this is something with the culverts that I was thinking of, and I'm invoking sort of my inner Jeff Goldblum Jurassic Park of nature finds a way,
Mm.
kind of thing. Um, but you're showing these great examples of how to, in a much larger, wider culvert, a way in order for animals to pass through there safely. Is there any sort of corralling that needs to happen, or is this just something where animals either instinctually or learned behavior will discover that and make use of it?
Yeah, I think the science is still learning about that. I know that in areas out west, they have used fencing and things like that to try to send animals in that direction. So far in the Northeast, we haven't had to go that route, but I think in the case of areas that we're looking at where there is lots of built um, roadways that are transecting these areas, that land conservation on either side to ensure sort of strips of or corridors for travel that don't have a lot of disruption, animals will naturally find those and end up using those crossings pretty regularly. So I think it's in the East, it's much more the behavioral that you're talking about as opposed to the physical corralling that they see in the West.
It's sort of the idea of if we can allow ourselves to, as you put, think like an animal, that we can kind of come up with these solutions, perhaps. Um, and within these pinch points that you're talking about, I kind of from the experience in the Mohawk Valley, and in talking with other people and some organizations I'm otherwise involved with, and some of the concerns over another issue with um, the current environmental state of the globe would be increased flooding and higher volume of flooding. So I put a note here that I can see kind of that benefit of taking the approach. This is a dual kind of approach to the concept of if there's a culvert replacement, that it should be incorporating a pathway for animals, and if it's wider and built in a certain way, that's going to mitigate some levels of flooding at those choke points within a culvert. Is there any sort of work that the Land Conservancy is doing in sort of the promotion of that idea as sort of a dual purpose, or is that, does that help the advocacy in some way?
Yeah, so we are taking a look when we do the mapping of this. We are taking a look at sort of flood prone areas and working with the Department of Transportation and also the Thruway Authority to discuss some of these issues. Um, and so yes, but it's very complicated because you know, when you look at some of those crossings, the culvert ends at the Mohawk River. And so if you're trying to get through the culvert to the dry part on the other side, you can't. And so how do we address a crossing like that for wildlife? So and flooding just adds another complexity to it. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see um, the data results and the recommendations that we're able to work with on the other side of this. That's a great question.
And you had mentioned in here, this the Appalachian Mountain Chain and these links, um, that we kind of, I guess, in our area in Montgomery County, being somewhat benefited by having the noses, the
Mhm.
Mohawk Valley being that connection, and the whole kind of reason, Schoharie Crossing being an Erie Canal site, um, that we have that connection on the east-west. So yeah, the impact of animals moving north-south um, is all kind of part of that. And one of the questions coming in on the chat was, uh, with the mentioning of sprakers and that Yoast sprakers, the noses area, is there anything other than the past summer's research? Is there anything specific that is being identified of what will be going on there at that location that you could kind of provide a little bit more detail or information to, or are you still in the assessment phase?
We're still in the assessment phase, but this particular the noses is a very it's a very interesting place because of its topography. It's highly resilient. We've been hoping to do some conservation work there for years and years because I always fear driving through there and seeing a billboard or someone building a monster house somehow at the top of one of them. That's such an iconic view of Montgomery County, and really historic view. But it's also so incredibly important, geologically, ecologically. And so, we're going to continue to work with willing landowners to do conservation work in these areas um, surrounding, you know, the pinch points. And so I think that there's nothing, we're doing the analysis now, but, you know, um, we're hoping to, on the tail end of that, do even more outreach to landowners to let them know, that there are ways that we can conserve those properties in the future. So hopefully that answers that person's question.
All right. And do you have a sense of another question? I'm gonna kind of paraphrase the question a little bit. So far as with that assessment in Montgomery County in that pinch point area, have you identified that there's particular kinds of culverts and the ease in which you're going to be able to create that a crossing, or do you have also like perhaps a number? Uh, Montgomery County in and of itself is something like 40 miles in length.
Oh
Do
yeah.
you have a could you share, do you know just how many of those would be and if there's quite a difference in the forms of culverting?
Yeah, so I don't have that information. That data is being crunched right now. Um, but I do know that they assessed, I think, something like 98 different culvert sites across those three different roads that I mentioned, four different roads. So 88, the throughway, 5 and 5S. And so, some of them are bridges. So anything larger than, I believe, 12 feet wide is considered a bridge. Anything 12 feet under is considered a culvert. And so it's going to be a while before we what the recommendations are for each one. And we just collected another round of game camera footage from the culverts that we had game cameras at, which was only a fraction of those. I think we deployed, I want to say like 40 cameras. And so TNC right now, the Nature Conservancy is going through slide by slide to pull the best of the best from those culvert cams so that we can get an idea of what the existing usage is by terrestrial mammals. Excuse me. And so that is when you take a look at the number of culverts and the protocols that the technicians had to go through, plus the game camera footage, there's just a lot of information right now that is getting all distilled. Plus, there's a whole mapping effort that's happening as well. And so we're hoping in early 2022 to be able to see some of those results. Um, and unfortunately, I don't have anything to share other than the bulk of the data that has been collected. Um, but I can't wait to see the results. It should be really interesting.
Yeah, and I would say all the more reason to have you back again in 2022 when some of those analytics come through and we can talk a little bit more about the data and reach out to more people hopefully.
Absolutely,
There's
yeah.
a comment coming in. This comment is, as a motorist who drives frequently in this area, I would appreciate better crossings, not only for my safety, but the safety of the animals who cross there. So,
Yeah,
valid point being made that, the safety of the animals and for folks, and insurance rates on their automobiles, less impacts would probably help. Um,
absolutely.
there's a question. There's a question here. Have solar farms impacted the animal trails?
So that is a great question, and I'm sure that those of you zooming in from or webexing in from Montgomery County know the level of pressure that's happening with solar installations right now. Um, we don't quite know what the long-term impacts of that will be, but I do think that uh, one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we do solar siting is permeability for wildlife. Um, and it can be as simple as space between panels, but also fencing around some of these areas. Um, when we do our conservation easements, we always assess the language that we use regarding fencing, because if someone wants to, it's one thing to keep deer out from browsing, but it's another thing to prevent, in a well-known wildlife movement area, animals getting from A to B. And so, there are ways to create fencing, especially in a solar field, um, to be able to allow that permeability. That's something I'm still learning. We're approached often to talk about solar, and you know, we're of course supportive with green energy. We just want to make sure that it's done in such a way that we're not giving detrimental effects that we can't reverse in the long term. And so just sort of being very thoughtful about that and keeping wildlife in mind, is what we encourage. So I love that question. I think it's great. And I'm looking forward to learning how and encouraging solar developers to keep wildlife in mind when it comes to those large installations.
All right. Well, we're hitting about the 45-minute mark, and so there aren't any other questions or comments coming through. So I will say, Sarah, thank you very much for this informative presentation. I've learned a lot. I've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward, like I said, perhaps a point next year of when you have that data compiled to discovering more and hosting you again, perhaps in person at the site would be nice.
Yeah, that'd
But
be
doing things
lovely.
virtually has been kind of fun. So thank you very much. And I hope that the work continues at whatever efficient pace that it can, that people and partners will come together and coalesce to make sure that the work that everybody at the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy and your other partners are doing continues for the wildlife and therefore all of us as human beings, and taking a view at the landscape kind of from the point of view of animals.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for those who tuned in this evening. And yeah, I'll be happy to come back in early 2022 and share some results with you all. I'm excited to see them and share them as well. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Sarah Walsh and the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy. Take care. Be well.